welcome back once again. Before we start, please comment down below where you are listening from and what time it is right now, or if you have any feedback to give me, or if you would like me to upload more often. Comment that down below also. Thanks. Let's get to it. June 10th, 1912. A neighbour knocks, then knocks again. No answer. The back door yields. The kitchen is still. A plate on the table. A lamp turned low. The sheriff steps inside and the air feels wrong. Curtains pulled, mirrors covered, a bowl of cloudy water, and an axe leaning near a bed. No sign of forced entry. No barking, no struggle anyone heard. 8 people, a family, and 2 visiting sisters, gone without a trace. What happened inside this quiet Iowa house? To understand why it felt staged, we need to go back to the last ordinary day. Sunday began with routine, the kind you only notice when it stops. Josiah Moore, known around Villisca as a steady hardware man with a careful eye for inventory, rose early. He'd built his business by keeping promises, fixing what he sold, and remembering names. Sarah Moore carried the gears of the family, church committees, meals, the small calendar nobody else saw but everybody followed. Their home, modest and tidy, ran on rhythm. The children were the sound of that rhythm. Herman had the early responsibilities, errands, and the little proud moments of being trusted. Catherine, almost a mirror of her mother's steadiness, liked straightening the hymnals. Boyd, energetic and impatient, raced through chores because play was waiting. Paul, the youngest, asked the questions older voices moved past. The psychology of the moment is important. These are not details for spectacle, but reminders of real lives, interrupted. That afternoon, Lena and Ina Stillinger prepared to attend the church's Children's Day program. Their family agreed to a sleepover at the Moors. It was a small choice in a safe town, the kind of decision that felt normal in 1912. They walked with the group that evening toward the Presbyterian church, dresses brushed free of dust, shoes not quite new but polished enough. Children's Day meant rehearsed recitations, steps practiced in kitchens, and shy glances from the lectern. Villisca's sanctuary filled with voices and the soft clatter of fans against palms. Sarah helped coordinate, a calm presence behind the bustle. Josiah watched from a pew, nodding as each child finished their part. People came to be seen, to listen, to confirm the ties that made the town feel whole. By the end of the program, daylight thinned and the air cooled. Neighbors talked on the steps, reluctant to go home yet wound down from the attention. The Moore family said their goodnights, gathered the Stillinger girls, and made the short walk back. At the time, the streets were safe, the lamps few, and the distance between church and home felt shorter than it looks on a map. A few witnesses later recalled seeing them near 9:30 to 10 o'clock p.m., moving as a cluster, tired but content. And then there was the house. A narrow front stair to the parents' room and a small bedroom where 2 children slept. A downstairs guest room where the Stillinger sisters would lay their heads. A kitchen that held the day's last heat. Doors that stuck if pulled too fast. Windows that squeaked unless lifted carefully. Details someone familiar with the home would know. Keys existed, but in small towns doors were often left unlocked. Who had a key? The Moores did, of course. Former employees of Josiah's hardware store might have known habits when the lamp was extinguished, which window was left open on warm nights. While that was happening in the Moore household, down by the depot a few people mentioned a man in dark clothing who didn't seem to fit. It was a small observation at the time, the kind you file away and forget until morning turns it into evidence. He loitered near the shadows of a freight car, hat brim low. What stands out now in retrospect is that trains brought quiet strangers to small towns and took them away again before anyone bothered to ask names. Inside, the night folded in. Shoes were set aside. A lamp turned down, its chimney sometimes removed by careful hands to dim the light. Beds made earlier were unmade in the practiced rhythm of a family closing the day. The Stillinger girls settled in the downstairs room, their presence an exception to routine, but welcomed. Upstairs, voices softened. The clock ticked. If there was a plan forming in another mind, it depended on that rhythm. Three elements mattered for what came next: time, familiarity, and patience. Time, because the street would empty and the world outside would go quiet. Familiarity, because the layout rewarded anyone who'd studied it or waited inside to learn it. Patience, because entering a home without waking it takes control. Investigators later considered that someone could have slipped in before the family returned, an attic with cigarette butts would be found, or simply tried a door after midnight, a risk minimized by a community's trust. Meanwhile, the children's day chatter drifted to silence, and the last lanterns in town were drawn low. A neighbor might have heard a horse snort, a screen door yawn and settle, nothing more. No barking carried through the dark. In missing person cases, silence is usually gradual. Here, it fell all at once, like a stage curtain. That was the last ordinary Sunday. A church program, a walk home, a house that knew the family's midnight shape. The next morning, the house would feel arranged, as if someone moved through it with intention. But inside those walls, before the quiet broke, there were small moments, whispered jokes, a good night, a familiar creak, now sealed away. There are two primary entry theories. The first is simple and common for 1912, an unlocked door, tried softly after midnight, yielding to a careful hand. The second is darker. Someone was already inside, waiting. Investigators would later find cigarette butts in the attic, a small but telling sign that a person lingered where nobody should have been. Which is more likely? Both were possible in a town that trusted its nights. If someone hid inside, they had to manage timing, noise, and nerves. The psychology of the moment is important. To wait in a cramped attic while a family settles below you takes control, a rigid patience that suggests prior practice or a familiar comfort in confined silence. You would hear floorboards, hushed voices, beds sighing as weight settled. Then, nothing. Only the tick of a clock and your own breathing, steadying for what comes next. If someone slipped in late, the house still favored quiet work. The kitchen held the first decisions, the lamp on the table, the chimney removable to mute the flame. Witnesses later described lamps set to a low wick, the light barely enough to guide a step. That suggests calculated movement. A high flame risks shadows at the window. A low flame keeps the world unaware. Signs of staging emerged, not all at once, but in a pattern. Curtains were drawn, and where a curtain was missing, clothing was pinned or draped to block a line of sight. Mirrors were covered, a habit tied by some to mourning custom, by others to superstition. Yet in a criminal context, it reads as control, removing reflections that might catch a glint or reveal a figure. Bedclothes were pulled over faces. That act, repeated, points to either shame, ritual, or a practical effort to suppress movement and sound. It could be all three, because offenders often blend practical needs with private beliefs. And then there was the food. A plate left out. The detail is not theatrical on its own, but in hindsight it matters. It implies time spent in the kitchen, a pause after or between acts. It points to a killer who did not sprint through the house, but moved, decided, perhaps returned to the table to eat, or at least pretended to. A bowl of cloudy water nearby suggests washing, a partial cleanup, the kind people do when leaving, but not fleeing. What about the sequence? Most reconstruction places the first blows upstairs, where Josiah and Sarah slept. If you are managing risk, you neutralize the adults before the children. The staircase creaks, so weight distribution and timing matter. A lamp turned low helps, but many offenders prefer darkness, trusting the map they have built in their head. The attic entry theory fits here. Emerging from above, stepping directly into that second floor. The unlocked door theory works too. If the intruder stood at the bottom, listening, charting, then climbing with the axe already in hand. Investigators considered small artifacts. The lamp wicks turned down to a precise level, suggesting someone practiced with lamps or learned quickly. The lack of significant footprints, despite dust and blood, hinting at careful foot placement or wiping. Heads covered, consistently, an organizing behavior. What stands out now in retrospect is that valuables were untouched, drawers were not ransacked, jewelry remained. The motive was not theft, it was dominion over a sleeping house. Neighbors had dogs, yet there were no reports of barking at the crucial hours. Some dogs do not bark at familiar scents. Others sleep through routine noise. It might mean nothing. It might mean the intruder moved with enough stillness to slide under a dog's threshold for alarm. Silent houses reward patience, and patience leaves fewer traces. The deliberate progression is hard to ignore, room to room, with pauses implied by the controlled lighting, the staging, the wash water. Whoever did this worked within a plan, but adapted on site. Clothing over windows when curtains were missing shows improvisation, not chaos. An axe left behind, belonging to the household, reveals a choice to use what was available, then abandon it as a message or simply as a discarded tool. There is a temptation to see ritual everywhere, to read meaning into coverings and water bowls. But here, practical and personal motives overlap. Covering faces reduces the human gaze in the moment, a psychological barrier for someone committing intimate violence. It also muffles sound. Washing removes residue that would betray touch on a doorknob or rail. Turning down lamps keeps the house invisible to the street. What nobody knew at the time was how little evidence would survive the morning. The killer seemed to understand that in 1912, silence and darkness were better allies than gloves or bleach. They entered without a sound, waited without moving, and left almost nothing we can hold. The house, by sunrise, looked like a stage after the actors had gone, props set just so, the audience unsure where the performance ended and the truth began. By the time lawmen could truly look, the house had already been touched by too many hands. Yet certain facts held. The axe rested inside, not far from where two of the children had slept. It belonged to Josiah Moore. The blade orientation told a simple, grim truth. Heavy blows delivered with the blunt end in some rooms, the blade in others. The handle carried smears more than prints, a sign of wiping, or damp hands, or both. In 1912, there was no fingerprint dusting on scene, no chain of custody discipline as we know it now. What stands out in hindsight is how basic the toolkit was: observation, memory, and notes in pencil. Bedclothes were drawn over faces in every sleeping space. Investigators spoke softly when they wrote that down. They did not speculate in their reports, but the pattern is clear. It is an act that removes the gaze, reduces contact, and practically quiets any stirring. Towels covered mirrors, and where curtains were missing, clothing was pinned to block the windows. Even at the time, people argued about what that meant. Was it superstition? A reflex from ritual mourning? In a crime context, it reads more like control, closing the room to itself, sealing sightlines, making sure the interior remained private until morning. The lamps mattered. One lamp had its chimney carefully removed, the wick tuned low to avoid smoke and keep the flame steady and dim. That is not something you do in a hurry, unless you have handled lamps regularly. Investigators considered whether the offender brought a light, but the evidence suggests he used what the house offered, customizing it for quiet movement. Light is sound, in a way. A bright room invites attention. A low wick gives you enough to navigate, but not enough to leak to the street. Then there was the kitchen. A plate left out, and a bowl filled with cloudy water on a sideboard. Water that looked used for washing. It is an unsettling detail because it signals time. A person who lingers long enough to eat or wash is not frantic. He is steadying himself, cleaning up enough to move through doors without leaving residue. In 1912, there were no luminol sprays, no DNA swabs. Washing hands was a crude but effective hedge. Cigarette butts in the attic, small and crushed, told a quiet story. Someone had been there long enough to smoke, more than once. Was that before the family returned from church, or later, during a pause? The house offered no clock on that. But the presence itself supports the waiting theory. In missing person cases, silence is usually gradual. Here, preparation replaced silence. Waiting became part of the plan. Blood patterns were read by eye. There were no formal spatter analysts, just officers who had seen accidents and fights. Their notes point to a sequential progression through rooms, not a chaotic rush. Some blows were delivered while the victims slept. Others suggest brief movement, then stillness. The heavier staining clustered near beds, with spatter tapering toward doorways. It led some to argue the killer stayed where he struck, minimizing trackable movement. And yet, a few faint transfer marks hinted at careful steps taken after the fact, possibly during staging, draping, covering, adjusting lamps. Valuables remained, drawers undisturbed. It is a stark absence that shaped early profiles. Without theft, the motive looked personal or compulsive. And yet, nothing tied any of the obvious suspects to the physical scene. No shoe print matched, no stray button identified a stranger's coat. What nobody knew at the time was how the crowd would erase micro-evidence, not just footprints. People touched doorknobs, peered into rooms, tugged at bedclothes, tracking dust where stillness would have told its own story. Sequence is the hinge. Most modern reconstructions argue upstairs first, Josiah and Sarah, then the children, then downstairs to the visiting sisters. It aligns with control, neutralize those who could resist, then move through the house's smaller rooms. Others have floated a downstairs first theory, pointing to the proximity of the back door and the kitchen lamp. But the staircase, with its creaks and tight turns, implies that if a person came from below, he still chose to climb early, risking noise when resolve was strongest. An attic entry makes that risk smaller. Step out, strike, then descend. A final note on the axe. Using the household tool is both practical and revealing. It removes the need to carry a weapon through town. It also co-opts the family's own object, turning familiarity into harm. The offender left it behind, leaning, not hidden. Was that indifference, exhaustion, or a deliberate signal? Investigators considered all three. In hindsight, the simplest reading often holds. After extensive effort, the tool was no longer useful. So, who could move through a home with that much precision and leave so little? Someone comfortable in darkness, patient with time, practiced with quiet tools, someone who understood small town nights and how a closed curtain and a low flame could cloak an entire world until morning. Morning began with chores. Mary Peckham, the neighbour, noticed the Moore house had not stirred. No children in the yard, no clatter from the kitchen, no Josiah heading to the barn. She waited, then crossed the yard and knocked. No answer. She tried a door, found it locked, and felt the quiet press back. That silence was unusual and unsettling. She called Ross Moore, Josiah's brother, who arrived with a key. What happened next remains shrouded in mystery, but the first thing they both felt was that the air inside was not right. They entered carefully. The kitchen was still, a lamp turned low, a plate left out, the bowl of cloudy water unmoved. Ross called out, "Nothing." He stepped toward the downstairs bedroom and saw what he would never unsee. He backed away, pale, and told Mary to summon the marshal. In small towns, news outruns telephones. While Mary fetched help, a ripple formed. Someone was missing. Something was wrong. By the time Marshal Hank Horton arrived, people had begun to gather, drawn by the unusual quiet and Mary's face. Horton took one step into the house and understood, in that first breath, that this was not an accident. He moved room to room with caution, but at the threshold of each space, he found the same final stillness. He secured what he could, then sent for the county authorities, and for a doctor. Meanwhile, the front gate creaked as more townspeople arrived, whispering names, trying to match schedules. Weren't the Moores at church last night? Where were the Stillinger girls? Within minutes, Villisca understood the scale. 8 lives taken, 2 families bound by the same night. Crowd control failed almost immediately. People pressed through the doorway, curious, afraid, needing to see to believe. Some crossed into rooms, tugged at curtains, touched door frames, spoke in low voices as if quiet could undo what had happened. The psychology of the moment is important. This was a community built on open doors. The idea that a home could be violated so completely was unbearable. and the impulse to witness became its own mistake. Footprints overlapped, dust smeared. Small details, the kind investigators need, were scuffed away. Newspaper men arrived quickly, tipped by early telephone calls and the kind of rumor that moves on rails. Reporters took notes at the edge of the property, then closer, and then, in some cases, inside. While that was happening in the parlor, a deputy tried to set a perimeter. Too late. Doctors entered, then a coroner. The house filled with layered voices, each new arrival widening the damage to the scene. In hindsight, those first hours erased more than they revealed. Across town, the Stillinger family received the call no parent should receive. They came to the property and were held at a distance. The courthouse square began to fill, people pale and shaken, asking the same questions with different words. Shopkeepers shut doors. Children were pulled indoors. The trust that underpinned Villisca's nights, the casual certainty that sleep meant safety, collapsed in a morning. Authorities tried to restore order. Horton and the sheriff posted men at the doors, started lists of who had been inside, who had touched what, but the damage was done. In the aftermath, investigators would argue about whether a print or a footprint, a thread or a smudge, might have survived if the house had been sealed from the first knock. Instead, rumor became oxygen. Stories multiplied. A stranger at the depot, footsteps heard, a lantern seen swinging at dawn. Some missteps mattered more than others. A piece of clothing that had been draped over a window was moved and then placed back. A bedspread was lifted an inch and set down again. The axe, left in the house, became an object people pointed at rather than evidence protected behind cordon. Each well-meaning movement rewrote the scene, and with it, the path investigators needed to follow. Fear translated into action. Hardware stores sold out of locks and bolts. Shotguns came out of closets. Neighbors volunteered to sit up at night, keeping watch on rotation, scanning the railroad tracks and alleys. Parents walked children to school in pairs. Church gatherings became vigils. The town's rhythms shifted toward defense, and every unknown face drew suspicion. Early press accounts, relying on witness whispers, printed errors that would linger for years. Some said the house had been ransacked. It had not. Some implied theft. There was none. And yet, the headlines captured something true. The magnitude, the scale, the rupture. Villisca had moved from a place where nothing much happened to a case that would define it. With fear rising, suspicion narrowed to those who seemed to fit the darkness. The name that surfaced first and loudest was Reverend George Kelly, an itinerant minister, short, intense, with a history of nervous collapses and unsettling behavior around women and girls. He had drifted through pulpits in the Midwest, rarely staying long. He wrote letters to congregants that crossed boundaries. He peered into windows, according to some complaints. At the time, those were oddities, tolerated or whispered about. After Villisca, they looked like signals people had missed. He was in Villisca that night. He watched the Children's Day program from the pews, eyes fixed on the stage. Witnesses remembered him lingering afterward, asking questions about schedules, repeating small details as if testing them. He left town early the next morning, on a train, carrying his valise and a reputation for strangeness. Was that coincidence or convenience? Kelly's fascination with the case was immediate and consuming. He wrote letters to authorities and newspapers, inserting himself into the investigation with a zeal that repelled and intrigued in equal measure. One letter, sent to a family member of the victims, described the scene with a level of detail that raised alarms. Investigators considered whether he was repeating published descriptions or hinting at knowledge only the killer would have. In 1912, leaks were common, and the press printed rumors. Separating unique detail from public noise was difficult. Then came the confessions. Kelly gave statements at different times that edged toward admission, then retreated. In one version, he described hearing sounds, seeing figures, sensing a presence. In another, he claimed to have committed the acts, then recanted under pressure. The psychology of the moment is important. He was highly suggestible, by many accounts, craving attention and vulnerable to leading questions. Interrogations in that era did not follow modern protocols. Coercion was not always physical. It could be suggestion layered over sleeplessness and isolation. What stands out in hindsight is that Kelly's confessions contained both obvious public facts and a few obscurities, but none that prosecutors could prove only the killer would know. He mentioned covered faces and a lamp turned low, details already circulating in town. He also offered specifics that conflicted with established timelines. When challenged, he adjusted, which undercut his credibility. The state pressed on anyway. Legal proceedings followed. At the first trial, the jury split. Some believed the portrait of a disturbed minister who sexualized the idea of watching and controlling. Others saw a man unraveling under scrutiny, pushed into shapes he did not fit. The hung jury forced a second trial. There, the defense emphasized the lack of physical evidence and the instability of his statements. Kelly was acquitted. For Villisca, the verdict did not resolve suspicion. It froze it. Why target him in the first place? Investigators and townspeople leaned on a profile of deviance, voyeurism, letters with prurient overtones, a fixation on the case. He returned to Villisca 2 weeks after the murders to join the crowd, to touch the edges of the story. That behavior reads predatory to some, performative to others. In missing person cases, silence is usually gradual. Here, Kelly's loudness made him easy to see. There were claims that he hired a car to drive past the Moore house on later trips, that he asked macabre questions, that he spoke of visions. He told a traveling companion the night after the murders that 8 lives were gone in Villisca before news had officially spread, according to testimony. The reliability of that account is contested. Memories in traumatic contexts bend under time and motive. What nobody knew at the time was how much weight those stray statements would carry in a courtroom devoid of hard forensics. Sexual pathology theories grew around him. Some argued the coverings and the lingering pointed to a compulsive offender who needed control more than property. Kelly's history with women, letters, unwanted advances was folded into that story, but the scene in the Moore house also showed organization, patience, and physical force. Could Kelly, slight and anxious, carry out an attack of that magnitude in silence? Physical capability is not a disqualifier on its own, but it shaped jurors' doubts. He did know schedules. As a minister visiting congregations, he learned who would be where and when. He had access to spaces others did not. He could move through towns without drawing notice beyond whispers. That access matters in profiles built on opportunity, and yet, no witness saw him near the Moore house that night. No object tied him to the rooms. No footprint matched his shoes. His train ticket placed him leaving early, but not necessarily fleeing. Investigators tried to reconcile his contradictions. A man who confessed and withdrew, who knew details and also parroted headlines, who craved the attention of being near tragedy. The psychology of the moment is important. False confessions happen, especially under stress, in suggestible minds, when the reward is attention or the relief of being told what to say. In Villisca, that possibility collided with fear. People wanted a name. In the aftermath of his acquittal, suspicion shifted, but it never fully left him. He drifted on, preaching in small towns, living under the shadow of the accusation. For Villisca, the Kelly chapter marks a lesson in pressure. When evidence is thin, behavior becomes the case. But behavior, without the anchor of forensics, is a tide. If not Kelly, who else could have planned an attack with such control? While Kelly drew attention with erratic behavior, another theory spread in whispers that sounded more like small-town politics than pathology. Frank F. Jones, merchant, banker, and eventually a state senator, had once employed Josiah Moore at his hardware and implement store. Josiah left to start his own business, taking key lines and, crucially, customers. In a town this size, that was not just a lost account sheet. It was personal standing, public pride, and money. The business split hurt. Jones had built his reputation on reliability and reach, and Moore's departure introduced a rival with the same relationships. Some accounts said the switch of the prized John Deere franchise from Jones to Moore deepened the resentment. Did it escalate to violence? That leap came later, after Veliska looked for motives that were not random and found a feud. Rumors took a simple shape. A man of influence hires a killer. Why? Distance. He would not need to risk his own hands. He would protect status while making a problem disappear. Townspeople repeated the story because it carried a clean logic. And yet, clean logic is not evidence. Enter William Blackie Mansfield in the rumor architecture. Mansfield, a drifter with a violent reputation, was tied by some investigators to a string of axe murders across the Midwest. In Colorado, a family was killed in a manner some claimed looked similar. Night entry. Household axe. Quick departure by rail. Mansfield's name became the bridge between Jones's alleged desire and the physical act. The theory went, money from Jones, muscle from Mansfield, silence purchased with fear. But here is the twist. Alibis and timelines cut into this narrative. Mansfield claimed time-stamped work and rail movements that placed him elsewhere for some nights. And when states attempted to link him to multiple scenes, details frayed. Meanwhile, grand jury sessions in Montgomery County called Frank Jones to answer questions, not as a handcuffed suspect, but as a man under a civic shadow. He denied any involvement. The proceedings produced no charge. Investigators considered the logic of a contract killing versus the intimate staging in the Moore home. Contract work, for money, often looks fast. Entry, execution, exit. The Veliska scene, in hindsight, reads slower. Curtains draped with clothing, mirrors covered, a lamp adjusted with care, the lingering implied by washing water. If a hired man was paid to erase a rival, why remain to tidy the set with such deliberate control? Perhaps to mask the act as something else, some argued. But then, why the children? That single question troubled the hired violence frame. An assassin targeting Josiah had no reason to expand the scale, unless impulse or compulsion took over. That possibility moves the story away from Jones and toward an individual psychology, not a transaction. Supporters of the Jones theory pointed to economic rivalry and alleged gossip about an inappropriate closeness between Josiah and Jones's daughter-in-law. Was that claim verified? No. It lived in rumor columns and barbershop talk, never anchored by affidavits with usable detail, yet it fueled motive narratives, rage disguised as commerce. The problem remains the same: motive without means. Unknown to them, across town, others were building a different architecture: rails, strangers, patterns. But the political undertow kept Jones in the frame. He was powerful, and power draws suspicion. When the community feels powerless, accusing the powerful can feel like justice. In missing person cases, silence is usually gradual. In Veliska, accusation filled the silence. Evidentiary gaps would not close. No payment trail surfaced. No witness attested to a meeting, a contract, a plan. No letter, no ledger, no overheard agreement survived to pin cause to effect. The state's own investigators drifted between the Mansfield lead and others, unable to anchor a timeline that put him in Veliska, night of June 9th, with the necessary knowledge of the Moore household. The best they had were rail schedules that could move a man in and out, and a cluster of similar crimes that might be coincidence or a pattern. From their perspective, prosecutors faced a choice: pursue a popular theory with political heat, or focus on the messy, stranger violence hypothesis. They did both, which diluted both. Grand juries heard Jones's name and produced no indictments. Mansfield faced scrutiny in multiple jurisdictions, then slipped away through lack of proof. The result was a public taught to believe, then told to accept doubt. What stands out now in retrospect is that the Jones theory endured because it explained things people did not want to call random. It gave shape to grief. If a rival ordered this, then the town understood the motive, even if it could not prove the act. But proof matters. Without it, the theory becomes a story that sits on the courthouse steps, repeated but never filed. Could a hired killer have learned the house's rhythm, staged the interior, eaten at the table, then washed in the kitchen basin, all to point investigators toward compulsion rather than commerce? It is possible, but layered deception is rare compared to simple operational needs. The Villisca offender demonstrated patience and an unusual degree of control. That suggests comfort with the act itself, not just a paid task. In the end, Jones left the courthouse as a man publicly bruised and legally untouched. Mansfield's name faded in and out of papers, attached to tragedies but never tethered by admissible evidence. Investigators' doubts sharpened. No direct tie. Friction in the timeline. A scene that looked, to seasoned eyes, more personal than contractual. If hired hands were not the answer, the rails offered another kind of suspect. While Villisca argued over politics, rails carved a different map. In the early 1900s, transient labor moved on freight and passenger lines, men riding in and out of towns without leaving names. Section crews, harvest hands, and drifters slept in yards and depots. Trains were arteries of unseen movement, a way to disappear in minutes. Investigators considered whether the killer arrived by rail, watched the Children's Day crowd blend into dusk, then waited for the town to sleep. The depot sat within walking distance. Witnesses mentioned a man in dark clothing near the tracks, hat brim low, an unusual and unsettling presence. Was he scouting, or simply another anonymous traveler? Similar crimes had occurred across the Midwest within a few years of Villisca. Families found in their beds, a household tool used, mirrors draped, lamps adjusted, a silent exit toward the tracks. Some called it the work of a Midwest axeman, a phrase that created pattern out of resemblance. The psychology of the moment is important. In fear, people connect dots, sometimes accurately, sometimes not. Yet the overlaps were hard to ignore. Unlocked homes, nighttime entries, oil lamps turned low, curtains closed, a household axe abandoned. In some cases, food left out. In others, an attempt to wipe down surfaces. These are not unique behaviors, but the cluster invites analysis. If the same hand moved between states, rail schedules would be the scaffolding. Railroad investigators and local sheriffs compared notes when they could, but coordination was limited. Telegraph lines carried headlines faster than affidavits. A deputy in Iowa might read about an eerily similar scene in Kansas days later, by which time any train that mattered had already pulled out. The killer, if he used the rails, had time on his side and 1,000 possible destinations. What stands out now in retrospect is how the rails granted both speed and anonymity. A man could step off at dusk, blend into the edge of a church crowd, study a house's lamp patterns, then step back on before dawn. Tickets were not consistently checked against identification. Freight rides left no paper at all. Forensic evidence, thin to begin with, evaporated over distances and days. But here is the twist. Pattern is not proof. Coincidence can mimic design. Some of the similar cases differed in important ways. No staging, no covered mirrors, a quick, chaotic assault rather than a controlled progression. Copycat fears further blurred the line. Once newspapers printed the details, any later offender could imitate drapes over windows or a low lamp to confuse investigators. So, who fits the rail profile? Opportunistic predators, comfortable in liminal spaces, men who have learned to wait, to watch for routines, to strike when noise is at its lowest. They prefer tools at hand, a rail spike in a yard, an axe in a shed, because carrying a weapon onto a train invites risk. They understand darkness as cover and silence as method. At the same time, the Villisca scene suggested familiarity with the interior. Clothing hung where curtains were missing. That is improvisation, but it is also adaptation in real time. A man used to moving through strange houses at night develops a template, a checklist, close sight lines, control light, prevent observation, exit unseen. The house becomes a set he knows how to manage, even if every set is slightly different. Did anyone see a stranger boarding a pre-dawn train that Monday? Reports existed, but none were precise enough to anchor a prosecution. Hats, coats, and valises were common, descriptions blurred. Tall, short, dark suit, grey suit. In the aftermath, memory stitched images together. The depot clerk remembered a face, then doubted it. A farmer recalled a figure on the right-of-way near 4 a.m. but distance and fog smudge detail. Strengths of the hypothesis are clear: mobility, access, a built-in exit. Flaws are just as clear: no direct tie, no recovered item, no confession that survived scrutiny. If a single offender moved through multiple states, he either avoided mistakes or benefited from the era's fractured policing. Or, several men committed similar crimes, and newspapers braided them into one. The psychology divides into two types: an opportunist who reads a town's rhythm, or someone with personal rage who leveraged the rails to vanish. Villisca's staging leans toward the former, control for its own sake. Yet the choice to remain, to adjust lamps and drape mirrors, suggests a need beyond escape. Control can be a compulsion, not just a tactic. In missing person cases, silence is usually gradual. In rail towns, it is scheduled. The midnight freight becomes a clock that erases footprints. The railroad killer hypothesis survives because it fits the landscape. An empty platform, a low flame, and a man who learned that distance is its own alibi. Staging, ritual, and control. Covering faces, draping mirrors. What does that mean inside a crime scene stripped of modern forensics? In cultural contexts, covered mirrors are tied to mourning, to the idea that a reflection traps the spirit or invites it to linger. In an offender context, it reads differently. It is about control, about reducing reflective surfaces that might betray movement, about eliminating the human gaze, even in its symbolic form. When the bedclothes are pulled over faces, repeated in room after room, the pattern signals a mind managing contact, suppressing sight and sound, and creating a buffer between act and aftermath. Food left out complicates the picture. Meat, cheese, a plate placed rather than tossed. These are quiet decisions. They imply time and a strange calm. Offenders who linger after violence are not always grandstanding. Sometimes they are resetting their physiology, eating to steady nerves, or pretending normalcy to regulate panic. The kitchen becomes a neutral zone, where a lamp's low wick draws the world down to a small circle of light. The psychology of the moment is important. Returning to a table after crossing rooms like that suggests a person who compartmentalizes, who can shift from action to maintenance without breaking. Bedding rearranged, clothing over windows. These speak to on-site adaptation. You plan to close curtains, then find a window bare. You scan the room, select a skirt or shirt, and pin or drape it to erase a sight line. This is improvisation aligned to a checklist. Close the room, dim the light, remove reflections, silence the house. The choices show premeditation directed by what the scene allows, which is common in organized offenders who risk entry without a weapon and rely on what the interior provides. The axe wiped partially, the bowl of cloudy water nearby. Ritual or practical cleanup. In 1912, washing hands, handle, and maybe a doorknob was the most direct hedge against obvious trace. Water clouds with fat and blood quickly. It tells you the act happened, not how well the washing worked. Partial wipe patterns on the handle suggest a quick pass, not a painstaking polish. That points to a balance. Clean enough to grip doors, not long enough to risk the sun. Practicality over ceremony, though the repetition of coverings and drapes can feel ceremonial to those who find the scene. The removal of lamp chimneys matters because light is a form of noise. Chimneys stabilize flames. Taking one off, then dialing the wick low, reduces brightness and keeps smoke minimal. It is hands-on work that requires familiarity, or at least calm observation and a careful touch. A flaring wick gives you away at the window. A low wick turns the lamp into a pocket of guidance, a moving keyhole through a dark house. The same logic applies to the sequence of rooms. Control light, then control bodies, then control traces. So was the theatricality genuine, guilt-driven, or misdirection? In hindsight, the drapes and coverings look less like grand theatre and more like method. Shame may play a role. Many offenders avoid looking at faces, but the operational benefits are clear. Covered faces impede sudden movement and muffle breath. Blocked windows hide silhouettes. Adjusted lamps keep the house opaque to the street. Even the food may serve a purpose. Time marker, pause, recovery, misdirection, if present, is secondary. The choices first protect the offender's passage. What stands out now in retrospect is how consistent the control behaviors are with patients seen earlier, waiting in an attic or entering quietly after midnight, then moving according to a plan that flexes. This does not read like a rushed assault. It reads like someone who rehearsed mentally, who mapped likely obstacles, and solved each with the house's own materials. And yet, even meticulous control leaves contradictions. The axe left behind, the plate not washed, the bowl still on the sideboard. These are loose ends that invite meaning, but sometimes loose ends are simply the cost of leaving before dawn. While the town argued over symbols, the families faced the absence itself. Control ended at the door. Grief began at the gate. Funerals came quickly, because they had to. Coffins were set in the courthouse square. A public heart turned into a place of mourning. Farmers stood bareheaded, hats in hand, faces rigid with the effort not to stare at the families. The lines moved slowly, careful, as if the pace itself could keep the day from finishing. Ministers spoke about rest, about mercy, never about why. The town listened, and the silence between phrases carried more weight than any doctrine. Inside that public grief, people tried to hold on to names. Herman as the responsible one who ran errands without being asked. Catherine, with a neatness that calmed rooms. Boyd, restless, racing the length of summer days. Paul with the questions adults did not mind answering. Lena and Ina Stillinger, welcomed for a sleepover after a church program that should have been the memory that ended Sunday. Friends offered gentle recollections, fishing trips, chalk on sidewalks, songs practiced at the kitchen table. Dignity mattered. They refused to let the case define the children's lives. And yet, daily life could not hold its shape. Shopkeepers propped brooms against doors and left signs that said, "Closed for mourning." But the deeper closure was psychological. People stopped letting children walk alone. Windows were latched during daylight. The small noises of a town dropped a register. Church became gathering place and guard post. Sermons turned into community briefings. Prayers into coordination. Mothers sat together in pews, hands clasped, whispering about locks, about dogs, about staying up until dawn. Vigilance became ritual. Men organized night watches, taking corners and alleys as if the town were a map they could protect by dividing it evenly. Lamps stayed lit in front rooms, meant to signal alertness as much as to cast light. Shotguns came down from mantels where they had been decorative. Nails found windowsills. It was not paranoia without cause. It was the body's response to a wound. Media attention created a second weather system over Villisca. Headlines invited gawkers who arrived by train to see the infamous house, then left with souvenirs of rumor. Some hotels refused those guests. Others, needing income, took their money and endured the questions. Pastors asked reporters to step back from gravesides. A few did, many did not. What stands out now, in retrospect, is how grief and fear redefined social rules. Privacy became a strategy. Doors stayed closed, not from unkindness, but from triage. Children learned to read adult faces, to measure danger by how long a mother stood at a window. Decades later, that first season still echoes in Villisca's memory. Open doors turned into thresholds you measure before you cross, and names said in full, as if speaking them carefully could keep them near. In the months after the funerals, the case hardened into files, then into drawers. Sheriffs changed, each inheriting a puzzle with smudged edges. Some reopened interviews, chasing rumors that had cooled into habit. Others focused on small, practical leads, shoe sizes, rail timetables, the provenance of a lantern chimney that might have been swapped. Private investigators appeared when families or donors put up money, promising breakthroughs that rarely outlived the season. The 1920s brought another pass at William Blackie Mansfield. Detectives in other states tried to thread him through a series of axe crimes, including Villisca, with rail lines as the string. They compared dates and distances, then found the knots slipping, conflicting alibis, employers who vouched for him, witnesses who faltered under cross-examination. He was questioned, even charged elsewhere, but nothing admissible tied him to the Moore house. Meanwhile, George Kelly's name resurfaced whenever a paper needed a suspect to anchor an anniversary article. Investigators considered both men known quantities, one too slippery to pin, the other too suggestible to trust. Files were lost, some to time, some to movement. Courthouse basements flooded. A box went missing during an office remodel. The chain of custody, informal at the start, frayed into gaps investigators later had to acknowledge. Newspaper archives became secondary casebooks. Clippings stood in for reports, headlines for affidavits. In hindsight, that dependence on press accounts distorted memory because early errors calcified into facts people repeated without rechecking. By the 1930s and 40s, criminology had a new vocabulary: modus operandi, signature behavior, offender profiling. But Villisca sat outside its reach. There were no photos detailed enough for modern analysis, no preserved prints, no clothing sealed for future testing. Detectives returning to the case applied the new language to old notes: organized offender, controlled scene, intimate distance. The labels fit, but they did not create evidence. Mid-century sheriffs tried comparative charts. They listed other Axe House cases: Paola, Kansas, Colorado Springs, Monmouth, Illinois. They underlined overlaps and circled mismatches. No mirror drapes here, no lingering there. A few pushed for interstate task groups, informal exchanges of letters and phone calls. Telegraphs were replaced by long-distance lines, but coordination still leaned on personalities, not systems. The house itself shifted from private property to contested artifact. Owners came and went. Some wanted quiet, others allowed limited access. By late decades, preservation efforts took hold. Boards were pulled up, wallpaper scraped back to reveal original patterns, rooms arranged to reflect 1912. Tours began, guided and restrained, with an emphasis on respect for the families. Researchers were given time to study sightlines, lamp placement, and the infamous attic. Ethical questions rode alongside: how to tell the story without feeding a carnival. Archival work deepened, court transcripts were copied, family testimonies gathered formally, distinguishing between first-hand memory and inherited story. Historians mapped timelines using train tables and weather logs, cross-referencing when dusk fell and when whistles sounded. The attic cigarettes, the bowl of cloudy water, the removed lamp chimney, each detail catalogued against known practices in 1912 Iowa households. The goal was not to sensationalize, it was to strip rumor, leaving the core contradictions as clean as possible. What stands out now in retrospect is how every generation projected its tools onto the case. The 1920s looked for the rail-tied killer. The 1950s favored the profile of a sexual deviant. The 1980s introduced behavioral categories that made the offender feel legible, if still unnamed. In the 2000s, with DNA as a cultural expectation, visitors asked why something could not be swabbed, tested, matched. The answer stayed the same: contamination from day one, evidence degraded, a scene handled by dozens before anyone understood what needed to be preserved. Even so, the record holds enough to keep inquiry honest: a timeline anchored by a church program, entry theories supported by an attic and a quiet door, staging elements documented by multiple early observers, suspect statuses recorded in court outcomes. Later investigators, sheriff or scholar, return to those anchors, testing each against new frameworks. The result is not closure, it is clarity about uncertainty. Decades of work produce no confession that endures, no fingerprint that points, no ledger line that pays a killer. Yet the careful reconstruction, the preservation, and the disciplined separation of fact from law did something quieter. They protected the story from erasure. The house remains, not as a thrill, but as an archive of questions that investigators still approach with the same measured steps a man once took on a narrow stair. Here's what the record supports. The family and the Stillinger sisters returned from the Presbyterian Children's Day program near 9:30 to 10 p.m. The house quieted soon after. By morning, with no movement visible, neighbour Mary Peckham called Ross Moore. Entry with a key revealed a staged interior and 8 victims. That is the confirmed frame. Entry remains a forked path, both supported by evidence. Theory 1 is an unlocked door, tried late. Theory 2 is pre-positioning inside, suggested by cigarette butts in the attic. Both align with a low, carefully tuned lamp, curtains drawn, clothing hung where curtains were missing, and bedclothes pulled over faces. The axe belonged to Josiah Moore. It was left inside. A bowl of cloudy water sat in the kitchen, consistent with washing. Food was left out. Valuables were untouched. Those details shape motive away from theft and toward control. Sequence can be outlined, not proven. Most likely, upstairs first. Josiah and Sarah, then the children, then the downstairs room where the Stillinger sisters slept. The pattern indicates planning, patience, and familiarity with quiet movement in darkness. What collapses under scrutiny is any certainty about who did it. No physical evidence ties a named suspect to the house. Crowd intrusion, from the first hours, erased traces that might have anchored a prosecution. Early newspaper errors hardened into folklore. We separate those out here. Plausible, not proven. The offender waited in the attic. He adjusted lamps with practiced hands. He lingered briefly in the kitchen. He covered mirrors and faces as part operational control, part psychological barrier. Speculative are ritual meanings beyond control, a contract order originating in town politics, or a single Midwest axeman responsible for every similar case. Psychologically, the offender profile points to organization and composure. He tolerated time, embraced silence, and worked within a checklist. Close sightlines, minimize noise, eliminate reflections, manage sequence. He was comfortable in darkness and able to improvise with the house's materials. Whether he was local or rail-born remains unresolved. Both are consistent with the scene. Why does the case endure? Because it struck at the foundation of small-town trust, sleep, family, home. Because 6 children were taken, and the community insisted on remembering them as individuals, not a statistic. Because the staging turned rooms into questions, the attic cigarettes, the low wick, the covered glass. And because the investigation, compromised at dawn, left enough shape to study but not enough to name. 1 house, 8 souls, a century of echoes. The unanswered core is not a void, it is a boundary. Beyond it lies what we cannot claim to know. Let's get to the second story. The room is already in chaos. Monitors wailing, a code blue called, a patient in sudden hypoglycemic freefall. Insulin appears where it shouldn't. The IV bag swapped, no surgery scheduled, no diabetes charted. A doctor orders dextrose, but the numbers keep falling. Is this an accident or something calculated? How many times has this happened before, without a trace? And who keeps letting him in? Let's get to it. To understand how a quiet, dependable nurse could do this for 16 years, we need to go back. He grew up in a small house where silence counted as safety. Charles Cullen's father died before Cullen could form clear memories, so the home carried absence as a daily weight. He was the youngest, a shy boy in oversized clothes, who learned early that the best way to avoid pain was to disappear. At school he was bullied, mocked for poverty, for awkwardness. The psychology of the moment is important. Humiliation teaches vigilance, and vigilance becomes control. When his mother died in a car crash while he was a teenager, any remaining stability collapsed. He tried to keep moving, but the ground kept shifting. He enlisted in the Navy, looking for structure, a uniform that could replace a lost identity. Instead, he found harassment and ridicule in the tight quarters of a submarine's electronics room. He was bright, meticulous, but isolated. The jokes escalated, the pranks, the relentless sense of being watched. Then came an attempt at suicide. Officially, he was transferred, monitored, and ultimately pushed toward discharge. Unofficially, a pattern formed. An institution confronted with a problem, choosing removal over rehabilitation, erasure over engagement. What stands out now in retrospect is that the behavior did not vanish, it merely moved. Nursing school gave him a new script. He was competent, quick with calculations, steady with IVs. He liked the rituals, hand hygiene, dosage checks, the click of a pump confirming a rate. Mastery over tiny flows of fluid, measured in milliliters, felt like mastery over chaos. He learned where the medications lived, how dispensing cabinets tracked withdrawals, how a charge nurse's glance could be avoided with timing. He learned that night shifts were quieter, that alarms could disguise a lot of human uncertainty, and that death in a hospital often arrives without visible violence. The first red flags were subtle, a fascination with medications such as insulin, digoxin, epinephrine beyond what classes required. Not questions about side effects, but about storage, waste, overrides. Peers noticed he lingered near the drug room, drifted back at odd moments, volunteered for tasks others did not want. He kept to himself, which in a hospital can look like professionalism. He was the nurse who stayed late, picked up extra shifts, covered breaks. In hindsight, these were the conditions he would later exploit. Trust, earned through reliability, visibility replaced by quiet omnipresence. At home, he tried conventional life, marriage, then children, but the strain of money, long nights, and untreated depression pushed him toward volatility. Arguments spilled over into accusations, then restraining orders. Police reports noted erratic behavior. The psychology of the moment is important. When public composure requires absolute restraint, private life absorbs the unspent pressure. Control has to go somewhere. Investigators later considered this domestic instability a red flag, not because instability creates killers, but because it reveals an escalating need to regulate an inner storm by any means. At work, his skill set sharpened. He could place an IV in a fragile vein, flush it cleanly, and never leave a bruise worth noticing. He knew the pharmacology that left scant residue, the lab values that drifted, then normalized if a patient survived. He learned to stage normalcy, document the vital signs, note the complaint, chart the relief. If a patient crashed, he could be first to respond, chest compressions crisp, voice even, a model of calm. In hospitals, heroes are made in codes, and Cullen understood that heroism could be a mask. Meanwhile, something else was happening. Instructors and early supervisors saw a nurse who moved quickly, who rarely called out, who knew policies just well enough to navigate them. But he also knew the spaces between policies. Waste a vial here, return a vial there, explain a discrepancy as a correction. It is the difference between a locked door and a watched door. Locked doors keep most people out. Watched doors require someone to notice. At the time, few did. Workloads were heavy, staff turnover constant, and a competent nurse was a blessing, not a question. Boundaries blurred. He took an interest in patients that seemed caring, then intrusive. He visited rooms off his assignment path, lingered after tasks were complete. Colleagues whispered, but gossip is not evidence. A supervisor asked a question. He produced a plausible answer. There was no body, no weapon, just medicine. Tiny doses, invisible intent. Autopsies in routine hospital deaths rarely tested for certain cardiac glycosides. Insulin vanished into the body's own chemistry. Without a trace, suspicion remained a feeling, and feelings did not make it into incident logs. The final ingredient was night. Night shifts offered cover, fewer eyes, more emergencies that could be written off as the hour's inevitability. He learned the tempo of 3 a.m. when labs ran thin and a single monitor covered too many rooms. He learned that pharmacy audits focused on inventory, not outcomes, and that a nurse's curiosity inside a medication dispenser looked like diligence, not reconnaissance. He learned the system's blind spots, the way a locksmith studies tumblers, by touch, rhythm, patience. This was the moment everything changed. He walked into his first hospital with all of that intact, competent, quiet, and unseen. He arrived at St. Barnabas wearing reliability like a uniform, punctual, steady, the nurse who volunteered for nights on the cardiac and intensive care units. At the time, those units lived with a high mortality baseline. People coded there often and without warning. That baseline concealed the first pattern. The psychology of the moment is important. When death is common, abnormal death blends in. The early signals were not dramatic. A patient stabilized after a routine procedure, then crashed with cold sweats and confusion. A stat blood sugar returned dangerously low, hypoglycemia that did not fit the chart. No diabetes, no insulin orders. Doctors treated the numbers. Patients recovered or did not, and charts moved on. The cause remained a shrug, attributed to stress, sepsis, or the randomness of fragile hearts. But here is the twist. These dips clustered, faintly, around the same nurses' shifts. Nurses saw what they were trained to see, alarms, not patterns. Meanwhile, a pharmacy algorithm, primitive by the standards of the 1990s, blinked at insulin movement that made little sense. Insulin was being accessed at unusual hours on units where it was not routinely used. It was not outright theft. Vials could be wasted. Paperwork could be corrected. The logs looked messy, not malevolent. What happened next remains unsettling. Lab techs processed panels that conflicted with medications listed. A patient's potassium and glucose wobbled in ways consistent with insulin exposure, yet no order existed. Another patient's heart rhythm collapsed without warning. Autopsies, when performed, looked for structural causes. Chemistry kills leave little theatre, and in the 1990s, few pathologists screened for insulin or digoxin unless a physician demanded it. Colleagues began to whisper. A charge nurse noted that codes felt denser on certain nights. A physician muttered about bad luck runs. But luck is not logged, and incident reports demanded specifics. Did anyone see a syringe? Did anyone witness a medication administered without order? No. Suspicion is soft. Policy is firm. In the aftermath, a decision was made that would haunt them. Cullen resigned. No police report, no external alert. References were neutral, the standard language of healthcare risk management. He left behind grieving families, unsettled colleagues, and a paper trail that described concern without accusation. The logic was self-protective. Without proof, escalation felt risky, and yet the deaths did not pause. They relocated. What stands out now, in hindsight, is the absence. No sentinel event review that named suspicion. No coordinated request to test post-mortem blood for insulin C peptide. No cross-unit meeting where nurses could say aloud what they whispered in break rooms. In missing person cases, silence is usually gradual. Here, silence was policy. Patients kept arriving. Many lived, some died. In charts, causes were listed. Statistically normal, emotionally numbing. Cullen gathered his last pay stub, turned in his badge, and walked into the parking lot. He would carry the same quiet into the next hospital, and the insulin-shaped shadow would follow. Unknown to them, across town at Hunterdon, the same quiet nurse slipped into another night rotation, now with a deeper understanding of how hospitals see and how they do not. Different building, new faces, same mechanics. The stakes were real. Mixed medical surgical floors, telemetry beds, and a patchwork of policies that looked strict on paper and loose in practice. He read those policies like blueprints. He experimented. Not with doses large enough to guarantee immediate collapse, but with what investigators later called test doses. Titrations of lethality. A little digoxin through a line, a whisper of insulin in a bag, sometimes a nudge of epinephrine to muddy the picture. If the patient's vitals dipped and then recovered, the data looked like volatility, not sabotage. If the patient crashed, the outcome read like the expected end of a fragile course. He learned from each result. Hunterdon's electronic systems differed from his last stops. Medication cabinets tracked dispenses, but not every search. Overrides existed for emergencies, and emergencies were easy to justify on a night shift when a doctor was not immediately available. Pharmacy rules enforced storage, not usage. Once a vial left the drawer, Follow-up depended on documentation, and documentation depended on the same nurse who removed the drug. The psychology of the moment is important. When forms become the reality, truth is whatever the form says it is. He refined his reconnaissance. He would open the dispensing interface and look up digoxin, note the bin, close it without pulling a dose. He would scan insulin availability on adjacent units, then volunteer to float. Those curiosity patterns rarely triggered alarms. The system caught theft, it did not catch intent. Meanwhile, lab anomalies, unexpectedly low glucose, sudden arrhythmias consistent with glycoside exposure, were buried in piles of results, emailed to inboxes at shift change, and archived by morning. Colleagues felt the wrongness before they could prove it. A night nurse mentioned that a stable patient went grey after a bag had been swapped for a fresh one. A tech commented that his patients seemed to code right when Cullen walked in to check on them. HR logged the concerns as interpersonal friction. Risk management asked for specifics and got stories, not specimens. He moved again to Morristown, a larger hospital with a reputation for rigor. He treated the new environment like a stress test of his method. Different EMR, different Pyxis configurations, more cameras near medrooms, but the same blind spot. The moment a clear fluid leaves a syringe and enters a bag is almost never surveilled, and the body absorbs the evidence. He adapted by minimizing touches. Small volumes, delivered when no one watched, through lines already in place, followed by care that looked exemplary. Meanwhile, something else was happening in the pharmacy back office. A vigilant pharmacist ran periodic audits and noticed that late-night insulin waste events skewed heavily to one nurse ID. She drafted a memo, attached screen captures of the logs, and suggested correlating them with adverse events. The follow-up stalled. Administrators asked whether she could prove a causal link. She could not with the tools she had. The memo was filed. What stands out now in retrospect is his calibration. He learned that epinephrine spikes made codes look like natural escalations, especially in cardiac patients. That digoxin, even in modest doses, could push an already stressed heart over the edge. That insulin, clear and merciless, was the perfect eraser. He layered these choices to match the chart, selecting the drug that would mimic the disease on paper. A rumor spread on the unit that Cullen was always around when patients fell apart. He leaned into helpfulness, appearing first at the bedside, initiating compressions, calling for the cart. In the story everyone told themselves, he saved people. When they died, he tried. Hospital culture rewarded presence under pressure. He collected quiet praise. Doctors, busy and triaging complexity, charted what they saw: atrial fibrillation decompensation, sepsis progression, electrolyte imbalances. They were not wrong, given the information in front of them. But here is the twist. Those narratives, built from labs and vitals, were being nudged from behind the curtain by a nurse who understood precisely how to distort the numbers. Policy gaps multiplied the effect. Credentialing verified licensure and checked references that said nothing actionable. Performance reviews focused on teamwork, punctuality, adherence to visible tasks. When concerns surfaced, HR guided them toward coaching, not escalation. Any attempt to involve law enforcement ran into the same wall. No specimen, no confession, no case. He sharpened his deniability. He documented thoroughly, even obsessively, charting pain scores, fluids, and assessments. He logged waste with plausible justifications. Partial doses, patient refused, physician changed the order. The chart, in essence, vouched for him. And in healthcare, the chart is the record that outlives memory. Then, a cluster of bradycardic arrests shook a single month. Nurses whispered, a physician raised an eyebrow, and a committee formed to review quality variance. The meeting generated action items, education, reinforced policies, reminders about med handling. It did not generate a phone call to police. Instead, administrators opted to restructure schedules and reduce reliance on night float. Translation: move him along without a scene. He left with a letter that said nothing and meant everything. The impact was immediate. but invisible. The method was sharper, the doses were smarter, the routes were cleaner, and the system, split by policies, burdened by fear of liability, comforted by paperwork, still could not see the hand behind the decline. New Jersey was getting uneasy. The whispers reached neighboring hospitals. He felt that pressure and did what he always did. He moved again, this time toward Pennsylvania, carrying the same calm smile, the same steady hands, and a more precise understanding of how to kill inside a hospital without a trace. 3 days later, he was on orientation at Lehigh Valley, a sprawling system where scale hid detail. The stakes were higher here: busy telemetry, step-down units, a churn of admissions that made nights feel like controlled collapse. Travel nurse status helped. Agency staff were welcomed for coverage, not community. He blended in, badge clipped, voice low, ready to work. He understood that volume was camouflage. In a hospital moving hundreds of patients, clusters dissolve into noise. He studied the Pyxis terminals first. Different menu trees, same logic. Search fields let him locate digoxin or insulin without triggering a dispense. He could walk away having left only a curiosity trail, and curiosity was not a reportable event. Within weeks, lab values began to whisper. A patient with ventricular ectopy stabilized on a low dose of digoxin, then suddenly registered a toxic range inconsistent with what was charted. Another patient's glucose swung down at 2 a.m., slammed by a drop that made no metabolic sense. The pattern, at first, looked like random volatility, but here is the twist. The swings lined up with his rounds. Nurses noticed something they could not name. Patients deteriorated right after he freshened the line, or swapped a bag. He said, looked low. He documented meticulously, the entries clean, assessment unchanged, fluids running, patient resting. When codes hit, he was first at the bed, compressions deep and timed, eyes fixed on the monitor. The room saw a rescuer. The records saw routine. Pharmacy audits flagged little more than inefficiency. Medication dispensing logs showed searches for high-risk drugs without dispense, odd-hour access that could be attributed to emergencies. Overrides were common because physicians slept and phones rang slow. Meanwhile, techs chased beep storms, drawing labs, printing results that piled on clipboards. The anomalies were there. Digoxin spikes, unexplained lows, but they were buried under volume. He attempted suicide again. Pills, isolation, a fragile moment in a bare apartment. Colleagues learned only fragments. A leave of absence coded as medical, a return to work with a soft welcome. Investigators later considered this instability a red flag, but at the time, the system greeted him with empathy and the need for staff. He slipped back onto nights as if nothing had happened. And then there was the cluster, a run of bradyarrhythmic arrests in a 10-day window, patients whose charts did not predict collapse. Doctors wrote guarded notes, possible digoxin effect, unclear source. Nurses whispered again, about bad luck. Bad luck does not search the Pyxis for digoxin 3 times in an hour. What stands out now in retrospect is his escalation. The doses became bolder, but never theatrical. Enough to push a weak heart over the edge. Enough insulin to force dextrose drips that sometimes arrived too late. He tailored each intervention to the chart. Cardiac patients nudged toward arrhythmia. General med-surg patients shoved into hypoglycemia that looked like sepsis complications. Administrators faced the same calculus. High workload, thin proof, growing unease. A supervisor initiated a focused review of Cullen's medication handling. They found discrepancies, a few incomplete waste logs, an unusual number of late-night accesses, but nothing definitive. He received coaching. He nodded, remorseful about documentation, vigilant about policy. He kept working. He moved to Eastern Hospital with the same timing he had used before, right after concern peaked, but before it hardened into action. Eastern was smaller, its corridors quieter, its nighttime surveillance softer. He learned the medication room blind spots in a single shift, noted where cameras ended, where a door blocked a line of sight. He set a rhythm. Check vitals. Step into medroom. Step out with nothing visible. Walk to a bedside with a calm face. Microstories returned. A woman prepped for discharge phoned her daughter to plan breakfast, then slumped into a glucose crash by dawn, revived, then crashed again. A man recovering from pneumonia sat up to breathe with a therapist in the afternoon, and by midnight his heart slowed, then stopped. Nurses charted interventions, doctors certified cause, families absorbed contradictions, the promise of recovery shattered by a night they did not witness. Medication logs at Easton started to tell a quieter truth. Queries for digoxin and insulin clustered around his login ID, often without dispense, often minutes before a code. A pharmacist drafted a note to nursing leadership. Patterns warrant review. The note triggered a meeting, talk of safety culture, reminders about proper waste procedures. He sat through the in-service, eyes down, a model attendee. Meanwhile, something else was happening. He learned the staffing grid, identified the shifts with fewer seasoned nurses, volunteered for them. He offered to precept new hires, a position that granted extra time in medrooms under the guise of supervision. His competence earned trust, and trust opened doors that cameras did not cover. An administrator at Easton proposed limiting Cullen's access to certain high-risk medications, a rare flicker of decisive thinking. But access limitations require physician orders and system changes, and change moved slowly. By the time the proposal reached IT, he was already interviewing elsewhere. Neutral references followed, the legal language unchanged, eligible for rehire not recommended, no mention of fear. He left behind patients whose deaths read like statistics, and staff who carried a private ledger of nights that felt wrong. He also left a sharper footprint: digital curiosity, lab anomalies, coaching memos. The escalation was measurable if anyone had stitched the pieces together. No one did, not yet. He moved again, across the river and back, toward hospitals that would finally listen to the data. For 16 years, he had studied the blind spots. In Lehigh Valley and Easton, he widened them. While Easton digested its unease, Somerset and Street Lukes were about to put language to it. He arrived with the same credentials and that same quiet competence, stepping into night shifts where the margin for scrutiny was thin. The stakes were immediate. 2 hospitals with seasoned staff who had seen enough bad runs to know when statistics felt like a cover story. At Somerset, a handful of nurses started keeping their own counts. Not a formal committee, just a cluster of notebooks with penciled marks, codes at 217, glucose at 28 with no orders, bradycardia after a bag change. They did not trade accusations, they compared rhythms. Meanwhile, a pharmacist, methodical and skeptical, ran waste reports and found Cullen's name recurring around insulin discrepancies, partial doses, unusual timing, documented wastes that outpaced the unit norm. The psychology of the moment is important. Staff wanted to believe in their colleague, but they also wanted their patients to live. A night huddle turned tense. Someone asked, "Why are all these lows happening on nights?" Silence answered. Then the shift broke to tasks. Off the floor, the pharmacist emailed nursing leadership. A pattern of late-night insulin waste aligned with adverse events. She attached CSV extracts, arrows drawn to the recurrence of one user ID. A doctor, blunt and tired of euphemism, finally put it in a chart note: hypoglycemia unexplained. Consider exogenous insulin. It was the first time the suspicion reached the formal record. Leadership hesitated. Legal risk hovered over every word. To accuse without airtight proof meant potential litigation. To stay quiet meant more funerals. Risk management pushed for internal review rather than external reporting. Meetings multiplied, language softened, quality variance, process reinforcement, medication stewardship. Cullen responded with the posture of compliance. He attended in services, signed policy acknowledgements, apologized for any documentation sloppiness. He offered help on heavy nights, ran codes with practiced precision. The records continued to vouch for him. His charting was clean. But here is the twist. The cleaner the chart, the more it insulated his acts. because auditors saw diligence, not deception. At Street Luke's, a similar unease took root. A pharmacist flagged digoxin activity, not dramatic pulls but those curiosity patterns. Searches without dispense, then codes on the same shift. She proposed correlating Pix's footprints with code blue timestamps. IT produced a crude overlay, logins clustered near collapses. It was not causation, but it was not nothing. A physician raised concerns to leadership, citing the overlay and clinical anomalies. The response stalled at the same edge. Insufficient evidence for police. Lawyers advised caution. Administrators rehearsed lines, "We have no substantiated findings." Meanwhile, nurses on nights compared the feel of the floor when he worked, a heaviness, an expectation of the cart rolling sooner than it should. He resigned again. No police referral. The pattern repeated. Neutral paperwork. References drained of meaning. What nobody knew at the time was that his next placement would intersect with better data and a single colleague who refused to let the pattern be filed away. In the aftermath at Street Luke's, a paper trail existed, but it was scattered and timid. Emails, memos, coaching forms, none of it assembled into a case. A pharmacist printed her reports and kept them in a drawer. A nurse saved her pocket tallies. A doctor saved that one chart note. Each believed they had done what policy allowed. None could force the institution to call the state. Meanwhile, he drifted between the two hospitals, collecting the same access. Night medrooms, override privileges, proximity to vulnerable patients. He adjusted his timing to the floor's pulse, bag swaps tucked into the lull between lab draws and rounds, doses small enough to blur into natural decline. If a patient rebounded after dextrose, it looked like a scare, not an assault. If a patient died, it looked like the expected end of illness. Somerset's internal alarms kept chirping. A data analyst, junior but curious, tried layering event reports over staffing schedules. The overlay pointed inward, mortality clusters aligning with one name. She took it to her manager, who nodded, thanked her, and asked for more context. She did not have access to pharmacy logs, and without them, the picture remained grainy. The file went back to her desktop. What stands out now in retrospect is that these hospitals were close to the truth, closer than any before, but they viewed each clue as a compliance issue, not a crime. Policy said coach, not call. Culture said protect the brand, not pierce the silence. The result was predictable. He left, calm and employable, and walked toward a facility where the software would be sharper, the audits bolder, and a friend would turn into the one witness he had never planned for. Somerset Medical Center did not look different from his other stops, but its software did. Night shift, dim corridors, the same whisper of wheels on waxed floors. Yet behind the scenes, Pixis cabinets logged every touch, and the lab system cross-referenced events that used to float past. The stakes were immediate. If the numbers aligned, the suspicion would harden into something administrators could not ignore. A hospitalist, methodical and tired of unexplained lows, started a quiet collaboration with a pharmacist who had been charting anomalies for months. They pulled reports, medication accesses by user, timestamps of codes, lab values around each collapse. For the first time, the overlays snapped into focus. Insulin inquiries and access events clustered right before hypoglycemia. Digoxin search trails lit up ahead of bradyarrhythmic crashes. This was not noise, this was proximity. The psychology of the moment is important. Clinicians want to trust patterns that save lives, not patterns that reveal betrayal. The hospitalist tested the idea carefully, choosing language that did not accuse. Outlier events, unexpected glucose variability, statistically aberrant timing. The pharmacist, less diplomatic, circled Cullen's user ID wherever it repeated. She sent the packet to risk management, copied the chief nursing officer, and asked a blunt question. Are we looking at diversion, or something worse? Meanwhile, Amy Lochran was watching. A night nurse with years of experience and a calm presence, she liked Cullen. He was attentive, gentle with patients, quick to help when her workload spiked. But she had noticed his searches. Late-night digoxin peaks, insulin lookups without a dispense, the way he seemed to be near rooms that ended in chaos. She brushed it off as coincidence, then saw the printouts from pharmacy. The lines connected. What nobody knew at the time was that the state had started to pay attention too. Somerset's internal reports, sanitized as they were, triggered mandatory quality notifications. Outlier events meant someone at the Department of Health opened a file. The hospital tried to handle it internally, but the numbers were building a case the old playbook could not smother. A meeting assembled: hospitalist, pharmacist, nursing, leadership, risk, legal. They stared at columns of times and names. The hospitalist pointed to a night where insulin access, lab draw, and code aligned within 30 minutes, twice. The pharmacist added that insulin waste logs under Cullen's ID far exceeded peers on similar assignments. Legal asked the same question every previous hospital had asked: do we have proof of administration? Silence answered. Then the hospitalist said, we have patients who are crashing in ways that fit exogenous insulin. We need to act. While that was happening, Amy began keeping her own quiet ledger. She watched Cullen's screen when he stood at Pyxis, noted the drawers he opened, the drugs he typed into the search field, the seconds he lingered. She followed the aftermath, vitals drifting, a cold sweat on a patient who had been stable, the scramble when numbers spiraled down. She was running out of ways to explain it to herself. The state alerts grew more direct. Statistical reviews of Somerset's mortality flagged a cluster on specific nights, Cullen's nights. A recommendation arrived: involve law enforcement. Risk management hesitated, then finally called the police. Detectives sat with the hospitalist and pharmacist, who walked them through the overlays. The detectives asked for a name. They got one. Investigators reached out to Amy. They needed someone on the inside who could read the floor's rhythm and read him. She agreed quietly, the decision heavy. She had worked alongside him, shared coffee in the break room, swapped stories about children and bills. Now she would help build the case that could stop him. Somerset's IT team pulled deeper logs. They traced Cullen's Pyxis footprint across weeks, searches for digoxin at 142A. Insulin waste entries at 308, code blues at 319 and 341, his user ID appearing in each chain. They pulled lab results from those nights, glucose in the 20s and 30s, potassium shifts that did not match physiology, digoxin concentrations inconsistent with orders. They found consistency where no one wanted it. Leadership, cornered by data, suspended him. Not a resignation, not a soft exit, a suspension pending investigation. In the past, that would have been the end of the conversation. Here, it was the start. Detectives asked to map the suspect's access to specific victims. The hospitalist and pharmacist built timelines. Patient A stabilized at midnight. Cullen accessed insulin at 12:14. Glucose crashed at 12:42. Patient B stable at 2:10. Digoxin query at 2:27. Bradycardia at 2:54. The lines converged. The psychology of the moment is important. Amy had to hold two truths without breaking. She knew a kind co-worker who helped her with difficult lifts and offered to cover her charting. And she knew the numbers. She met investigators off-site, shared her observations, explained unit routines. If they wanted to confront him, they needed leverage he could not explain away. Data alone rarely makes someone admit intent. Human connection might. Somerset's internal alarms changed tone. This was not risk management language anymore. It was criminal suspicion. The hospital gave detectives access to logs under subpoena. The state moved from aberration to threat. Families began to ask sharper questions, and for once, administrators did not smooth them away. The air in the unit felt different, tight, watchful. Cullen sensed pressure. He asked Amy if anyone was talking about him. She deflected, studied his face for cracks. He kept working his calm, but he made fewer searches, avoided obvious patterns. It was too late. The case had momentum. In meetings, Someone said out loud what others had whispered for years. People are dying who should not be dying. It cut through the legal caution. They reached a point that previous hospitals never reached. They called the police, they enlisted a nurse, and they let the data speak. This was the moment everything changed. Amy agreed to wear a wire. She agreed in a small conference room that smelled like old coffee and dry erase markers. Detectives laid out the stakes. They needed proximity. They needed his language. And they needed it recorded. Amy Lochran listened, steady, her hands folded, the weight of her decision untangling in slow breaths. She knew the unit's rhythm, she knew his habits, and, worse, she knew his kindnesses. The psychology of the moment is important. Trust makes betrayal possible, and that same trust can be repurposed to stop it. They fitted her with a recording device, light, hidden beneath a sweater. She practiced casual conversation, open-ended prompts, the gentle nudges that let a person narrate themselves. Detectives briefed her on boundaries. Do not accuse. Do not corner. Keep him talking. The goal was not a dramatic confession. It was a chain of statements that placed him near drugs, near patients, near the moments everything collapsed. She nodded. She would ask about night shifts, about stress, about why the numbers looked the way they did. Back on the unit, she approached him with their normal ease. Coffee at the end of the hall, quiet jokes about broken printers, the low chatter nurses used to keep exhaustion at bay. She started small. Rough week? He sighed, said nights had been heavy. She asked about the audits, said leadership was on edge. He agreed, said administration did not understand the flaw. She let silence fill the space, a technique investigators taught her. People explain silence. He began offering justifications without being asked. Patients were too far gone, he said. Cardiac patients spiral fast. He framed codes as the natural end of failing bodies, and in a hospital, that story feels true. But here is the twist. He also talked about patterns, how labs did not always capture what was really happening, how insulin would not show in a typical autopsy. He said it like a clinical observation, not a boast. The recorder caught it. Meanwhile, investigators mapped his Pyxis footprints to patient collapses. They aligned timestamps, then pushed those into Amy's ear through pre-meeting briefings. Ask him about the night of the 23rd, they said. He accessed insulin at 1:13 a.m. There were 2 codes before 2. She obeyed the rhythm. Over another coffee, she mentioned a patient by first name, a night by date, then waited. He did not confess, but he tilted toward explanation, blaming the disease, calling it inevitable. He would say, "We did what we could," then add, "Sometimes measures accelerate decline." Accelerate. The word sat heavy on tape. The psychology of the moment is important. Amy had to stay close enough to keep him talking, distant enough to stay safe. He sensed pressure from the hospital, and he leaned on her for reassurance. She offered it, then steered gently. "You've always been careful," she said. "You're meticulous." He agreed, said he knew where meds were, knew how to handle waste by the book. He mentioned insulin waste as if reciting policy, then admitted waste logs do not always match what you pull. The recorder caught that too. They met off shift once, at a diner, vinyl seats, and a waitress who called everyone honey. Detectives waited outside, close enough to respond, far enough to remain invisible. Amy asked about leaving Somerset, floated the idea that he might be targeted unfairly. He latched onto that, then drifted toward fatalism. "People die," he said. "Sometimes we stop suffering." He used language that sounded like mercy. "And mercy can be a shield." She asked, "Did you ever help them along?" He looked at his coffee, said, "I eased things, then retreated into abstraction." The recorder captured the pivot, the near admission, the euphemism. At work, the pressure tightened. He stopped searching obvious drugs on Pyxis, avoided insulin queries that drew a straight line. Investigators considered that a tell. He knew he was being watched. Amy's role grew riskier. She kept the wire beneath layers, kept her face neutral when codes sounded. She held hands with families and then sat with detectives in unmarked cars, voice low, repeating fragments of his speech so they could align sentiment with timestamps. Meanwhile, the data strengthened. Overlays now showed not just proximity but patterns of behavior, searches, waste entries, then crashes. Investigators pushed Amy to press on method. How would someone do it, hypothetically? She framed it as nursing curiosity. Could insulin in a bag even be detectable? He said, not in the ways they test. He mentioned C-peptide, a detail many nurses would not volunteer casually. He said it like a lecture. The recorder held the clinical precision. There were moments of real fear. He asked her outright if anyone had told her to watch him. She deflected, turned it into commiseration. They watched me after a med error last year, she said, and he softened, started talking about unfair policies, about administrators who did not understand bedside work. He slipped, briefly, into remorse language, said he felt bad, that sometimes it was not supposed to go that far. Not a confession, but a crack. The detectives coached her to deepen that crack. Next shift, she brought up a specific patient who survived a dextrose drip after a sudden low. That was scary, she said. I thought we were going to lose her. He looked tired, then said, that would have been better. It landed like lead. The recorder caught the utilitarian logic, the idea that death can be preferable, administered, or welcomed. Please leave a like and subscribe for daily true crime stories. She walked the line a little longer, gathered a few more phrases, and the mapping reached a threshold prosecutors could use. Enough leverage for an arrest, because the human connection had finally forced the method to speak out loud. They took him quietly. Parking lot, grey sky, a request to come down to the station to clear up questions. He did not resist. He had been suspended. He knew pressure was closing in. Detectives sat him in a neutral room, pale walls, a recorder in the center of a metal table. They offered coffee, a small human gesture that often loosens the first knot. Prosecutors needed specificity, names, dates, methods. Families needed answers. Jurisdictions complicated everything, because the suspected crimes crossed county lines and state borders. The psychology of the moment is important. When cases sprawl, momentum dies unless the suspect helps centralize the truth. That is why the strategy focused on narrowing his deniability. They started with timelines. A detective slid forward a sheet. Dates, patient initials, glucose values in the 20s. The exact minutes his Pyxis ID accessed insulin. He stared, expression flat, then said he did not remember those nights. Another sheet followed, bradyarrhythmic arrests, digoxin searches under his login. A code within half an hour. He kept his eyes down. I do not recall. The phrase was a shield, but the pattern was relentless. What stands out now in retrospect is how the questioning moved from abstract to microscopic. They did not ask, did you kill patients? They asked, why did you access insulin at 1:13 when no diabetic orders existed, and why did a patient crash at 1:42? He said he had checked stock. He had been preparing for possible orders. They asked, why does your waste logging far exceed peers on identical assignments? He said he was thorough. Thoroughness does not generate bodies. They shifted to language he had used with Amy. C-peptide, detectability, accelerate decline. Detectives gauged his flinch. It was there. He had assumed those words lived only in late-night conversations. Now they were on the table. He asked for a lawyer. The interview paused. Legal counsel arrived, assessed the room, and asked for discovery. Prosecutors held their line. The state had enough to charge, but they wanted the full ledger. The death penalty hovered in the background in one jurisdiction. Leverage. The next session was different. They offered him an outline. Cooperation in exchange for avoiding capital punishment, a plea that acknowledged scope without demanding every name up front. Continued interviews to fill gaps. He weighed the proposition. He was a nurse who had learned systems. Now he read the legal system for angles. A confession could spare him death. He agreed to talk. The first admissions were narrow. He acknowledged administering insulin without orders to ease suffering. Detectives pressed for names. He gave one, then another. He shifted to digoxin, called it a mistake once, then admitted intent. Methods emerged, sparse but clinical. Small volumes into IV bags, doses that would push hearts already teetering. Insulin added to lines the way he had described, unseen, untraceable in standard screens. He said epinephrine, sometimes, to confuse the readout. He spoke as if dictating a procedure, but here is the twist. The number remained uncertain from the start. He referenced dozens, then many, then nodded when a detective floated a larger range. Investigators considered cross-state victims, asked about St. Barnabas, Warren, Hunterdon, Morristown, Lehigh Valley, Easton, Street Lukes, Somerset. He confirmed clusters, denied some nights, could not or would not recall others. The ledger would not settle. Some cases had labs, logs, and timing. Others had only a family's memory of a stable night that ended badly. Prosecutors prioritized those with evidence that could stand in court. He signed a plea deal, multiple counts of murder and attempted murder, multiple life sentences, parole eligibility, stacked so far into the future that it functioned as never. Death penalty off the table where it applied. In exchange, he would keep meeting with detectives to identify victims by hospital, unit, and rough date. It was not absolution. It was logistics. Families would get names where possible. In interrogation rooms, he sketched details that matched forensic anomalies. Insulin into normal saline, digoxin through central lines, night-hour timing to avoid visiting physicians. He described selecting patients whose charts made death plausible. He framed it as relief, as mercy. The psychology of the moment is important. Euphemism is a common refuge for people who have done harm. He leaned on it until detectives anchored him to specifics. Name, date, dose. He complied in part. As he talked, officers called families. A daughter who had asked a blunt question years earlier, "Was my mother given insulin?" finally heard the state say yes. Some felt relief, a bitter certainty replacing doubt. Others felt everything rip open again. They learned how their loved ones died. Closure and trauma can coexist. This was one of those times. The public tally stabilized at a confirmed count well into the dozens, with suspicions extending higher. Hospitals faced the press, hedged, then promised reforms. Prosecutors stood at podiums with diagrams of Pyxis queries and lab values. The human figure at the center sat in county blues and stared at his hands. What stands out now is the opacity that remains. In a traditional homicide, a weapon exists, a scene persists. Here, chemistry erased the edges. The confession filled some blanks, not all. Investigators kept pressing, scheduling follow-ups, bringing lists with initials and dates. He would nod, remember a detail, contradict himself, retreat. The ledger remained incomplete, a chilling mystery with anchors but no full shoreline. He went to sentencing in a quiet procession. Families spoke, voices steady or breaking, recounting final meals, last conversations, the dissonance between promised recovery and sudden collapse. Judges read the terms, life layered upon life, parole mathematically impossible. He did not look up often. In the aftermath, the question lingered. How many? The honest answer is that no one knows. The system that allowed him in also allowed some victims to vanish without a trace in the record. The plea avoided death. The sentences ensured he would die inside. The counting never really stopped. For years, administrators treated patterns like inconveniences, not alarms, and that posture became his shield. The stakes were enormous. Trust in hospitals, the expectation that patients are safest where expertise concentrates. Instead, a nurse learned to navigate blind spots, and the system taught him how. Credentialing was the first gap. Hiring teams verified active licenses, ran criminal checks, and called references that were scripted to be neutral. When a hospital let him resign, HR at the next site heard phrases like, "not a good fit," and eligible for rehire, not recommended, language engineered to avoid lawsuits. Nothing in those calls communicated lethal suspicion. The psychology of the moment is important. Institutions protect themselves first, even if that means passing along risk. Agency nursing widened the opening. Staffing shortages turned travel nurses into a lifeline. Agencies moved paperwork quickly, placements faster, and employers, desperate for coverage, prioritized a reliable night nurse over deeper scrutiny. He capitalized on speed. The faster the onboarding, the fewer questions about gaps, counseling forms, or unusual waste logs. Inside hospitals, data lived in silos. Pharmacy tracked inventory, not outcomes. Nursing tracked charting compliance, not drug search curiosity. Quality teams plotted mortality, but without integrating PICS's footprints or unit schedules. Each dataset reflected competence within its lane, yet none combined to reveal intent. Investigators later showed that simple overlays, access logs, code timestamps, lab results, exposed proximity. At the time, those overlays were not routine. Autopsies were another failure. Most in-hospital deaths did not trigger full toxicology, and when they did, screens often ignored insulin and digoxin unless a physician specifically requested them. Without targeted testing, chemistry vanished into chemistry. A fatal insulin dose can look like a body failing on its own unless C-peptide is measured. Few asked. Few knew to ask. Policy framed divergence as documentation error. Waste mismatches? Coach the nurse. Odd hour access? Remind the unit about overrides. Hospitals approached medication irregularities as compliance issues, not potential crimes. Risk management's vocabulary, variance, remediation, education kept the problem administrative. Language matters. When you call harm a variance, you treat a serial pattern like a teachable moment. Legal exposure chilled action. Attorneys warned leaders about defamation, discovery, and brand damage if they accused without airtight proof. Therefore, administrators leaned on the absence of eyewitnesses or syringes. But here is the twist. The very nature of his method eliminated those artifacts. Waiting for a smoking gun inside an IV crime means waiting forever. Culture compounded the gaps. Nurses learned to normalize chaos, physicians triaged crises, and heroism in codes covered unease with gratitude. He arrived first at bedsides and earned praise that blunted suspicion. Complaints from colleagues were filtered through HR as interpersonal friction. Without a clear rule violation, leadership defaulted to harmony over confrontation. Regulators were not built for this either. Mandatory reporting focused on discrete sentinel events, not low-signal patterns spread across months and units. State alerts kicked in late because the hospital's own framing softened the metrics, outliers, not threat. And when alerts did land, they often asked for plans of correction, not immediate law enforcement involvement. Why did this last 16 years? Because every safeguard assumed good faith. Systems prevented diversion, not covert administration. Software prevented theft, not intent. Cameras guarded doors, not the clear syringe that touched a clear bag for 3 quiet seconds. Then came reforms, uneven but real. Mandatory reporting sharpened, forcing hospitals to notify authorities when patterns suggested internal harm. Drug cabinets evolved from inventory tools to behavior monitors, flagging unusual search and access sequences for high-risk drugs. Sentinel event reviews began pulling pharmacy, nursing, lab, and staffing data into one timeline, so proximity could not hide inside separate folders. Autopsy guidance updated. C-peptide for suspected insulin cases, broader digoxin assays when arrhythmias lacked explanation. Hospitals rewrote references, moving from bland, not a fit, to factual disclosures, when safety concerns existed, protected by statute in some states. Agency onboarding stretched, adding cross-facility checks that requested quality and risk contacts, not just HR. Some institutions restricted high-risk medications from floor stock, requiring witnessed draws, dual signatures, and immediate administration, closing the bag priming window he had relied on. And yet, For all this, vulnerabilities persist. Understaffing still creates thin nights where a single vigilant pharmacist cannot cover every anomaly. Data science exists, but adoption varies. A hospital's analytics may be world-class, or it may live on spreadsheets a single person maintains between other duties. Culture remains decisive. If leadership treats patterns as PR problems, the best software simply documents denial. In hindsight, many deaths were preventable if someone had overlaid logs, trusted the floor's unease, and called police sooner. The lesson is blunt. Patient safety is not just protocols, it is the courage to name a crime when evidence is statistical, behavioral, and human rather than cinematic. He operated for 16 years because the system preferred certainty to action. He stopped when people decided uncertainty was enough to act. Names, not numbers. That is where the truth lives, in the ordinary details that medicine cannot chart. An aide remembered Mr. R., a retired bus driver who lined up his dentures on a tissue and asked for the morning paper before dawn. He had been walking the hall with a therapist, telling jokes about potholes. At 2:40 a.m., he was cold, sweating, asking why he could not see straight. By 3:05, he was coding. His daughter kept the discharge instructions he never used, folded in her purse, creased at the edges. A grandmother, Mrs. L., spent the afternoon telling her nurse about a soup recipe that always fixes a cold. She had circled Sunday on the whiteboard, home day. Night came, a bag was changed, and the way a room feels when blood sugar plummets settled in. That clammy panic, the sudden drift into nonsense words. She never made it to Sunday. At the funeral, her son recited the recipe from memory, as if the steps could bring the clock back. The psychology of the moment is important. Survivors do not just lose a person. They lose the continuity that makes memory kind. A son who had argued with his father about a TV remote 2 hours before visiting restrictions took hold carried that last sentence like a lodged stone. A granddaughter who promised to bring a sweater because the room felt drafty never got to deliver it. Grief, layered with doubt, metastasized into questions the system could not or would not answer for years. Nurses remember too. One kept a sticky note in an old badge wallet with 3 first names and 3 times 217, 319, 402. Nights that would not leave. She still hears the particular pitch of a monitor when a heart drops into a Brady drift, different from ventricular chaos, almost a sigh. She wondered for months whether she missed something, whether a snack, a check, a pause could have altered the arc. It is a kind of survivor's guilt that grows in silence. In court, families faced him and read their ledgers aloud. Not rage alone, though there was rage, but detail. A last crossword puzzle left half finished. A voicemail that said, "Do not worry, I am fine," time-stamped 2 hours before a code blew. A plastic bag with slippers that never touched a hallway. One woman brought her father's pocket watch, showed the judge the hairline crack he had put in the crystal working on a fence, then said the dates out loud, admitted, stabilized, died. What stands out now in retrospect is how often the stories hinge on the quiet promise of recovery. Not dramatic miracles, just discharge plans, PT schedules, new pill organizers waiting on kitchen counters. The violence here was the erasure of expected mornings. Victims were not selected for moral reasons. They were selected for plausibility. A failing heart can absorb a digoxin nudge without indicting anyone. A fragile pancreas can be blamed when insulin appears without a test for C-peptide. The choice to kill hid behind the story of natural decline. Communities held memorials where the medicine was barely mentioned. Churches filled with casseroles and photographs. Nurses hugged by neighbors who did not know what to say. Doctors standing in the back row with their hands clasped. Lawsuits followed for some, stipends and settlements that read like translations, numbers meant to stand in for ruptures that do not quantify. Others refused lawsuits, not out of forgiveness, but because they did not want to spend the next years in depositions repeating the worst nights of their lives. The ledger includes caregivers who were not on the clock. A wife who slept in a recliner, feet tucked under a blanket, woke to the sound of a code cart and never forgave herself for dozing. A son who missed the late-night call because he had put the phone on silent before a meeting kept the voicemail forever, the one that says, "We are taking him to ICU, call us back." He still plays it once a year, on the admission date, then turns the phone face down on the table. And then there are the patients who survived the lows, revived by dextrose drips and vigilance, and left with fogged days they cannot explain. A man, 48, remembers a nurse saying, "Stay with me," then nothing until a bright square of morning through a slat in the blinds. He went home and could not shake the fear of sleep for months. He does not know his brush with death was not disease. The file that would tell him remains sealed in an archive he never asked to see. Hospitals built memorial walls, names engraved next to names that would have been there regardless, because hospitals are where illness ends. The difference is context, and context does not chisel easily into stone. Some institutions created scholarships in nursing ethics, endowed lectureships on medication safety. Those gestures matter, and yet the families still sit with smaller, stranger rituals, keeping a mug unwashed in the back of a cabinet, leaving a chair angled as it was when a goodbye felt temporary. The psychology of survivors evolves. At first, there is fixation, labs, charts, the ritual of requesting records and learning to read the grammar of glucose and rhythm strips. Then, for some, there is fatigue. They put the binder away. For others, there is purpose. They learn the vocabulary of legislation, testify at hearings about mandatory reporting, insist that neutral references be outlawed when safety is at stake. They turn grief into policy, because that is the only way their ledger feels like it can add a credit to a page that is all loss. Nurses, too, organized inside their own ethics. Some began insisting on dual signature policies for high-risk meds, even when the unit resisted the extra burden. Others created unofficial watch lists, colleagues who seemed to be near too many crises, not to accuse, but to force awareness. A pharmacist wrote an internal white paper on curiosity patterns in dispensing systems, a dry title that masked a simple plea, "Look where intent hides." For the victims' families, anniversaries split in two, the day of the diagnosis that promised a path, and the day of the erasure. Every year, hospital mailers arrive asking for donations. Some send money, hoping the system can teach itself not to repeat what happened. Others toss the envelopes. Both responses make sense. In a story like this, faith is personal, and there are names we will not say because we cannot, not with certainty that meets the standard of proof courts require. Those names belong to private ledgers, to kitchen tables where siblings compare remembered times and decide they know, even if nobody will ever call with confirmation. The count will never be complete. The human ledger remains the only document that holds both the silence and the sound, the last laugh, the last recipe, the last ordinary plan before a night that should not have ended it.